You're trapped in a prison you cannot see. Modern science has made its greatest mistake by turning your consciousness into a prisoner of matter. While mainstream scientists insist you're nothing but your brain, an intellectual elite hides the devastating truth that would dismantle the entire materialist paradigm. Think about it. How can your mind, using only biochemical elements, explain its own existence? It's mathematically impossible. Ancient wisdom traditions knew what quantum physicists like Max Planck discovered. Consciousness is fundamental. Matter is derived from consciousness. This information has been systematically silenced in universities and scientific publications because it threatens power structures established for centuries. Your brain doesn't produce consciousness. It merely filters and limits it. Like a prism refracting light, reality is exactly the opposite of what you've been led to believe. And once you truly understand this, you can never return to your former perception of the world. Modern science has committed its most serious error by transforming consciousness into a prisoner of matter. This fundamental inversion has completely distorted our understanding of reality and trapped us in a conceptual labyrinth with no exit. We face a monumental paradox that most materialist scientists and philosophers flatly refuse to confront. When we deeply analyze the nature of mind and consciousness, we encounter an inescapable contradiction that challenges the foundations of Western thought. How can the mind, the tool we use to investigate the universe, decipher its own essence? Our intellectual journey follows the path of a tireless investigator who, by systematically questioning each established scientific assumption about consciousness, is inevitably confronted with a truth radically counterintuitive to modern Western thought. What if consciousness is not a byproduct of brain activity, but the primordial field where all experience manifests? The dominant narrative in contemporary neuroscience insists that you are your brain, nothing more than a complex network of neural connections producing the illusion of subjectivity. However, this materialist view faces a devastating problem. It presupposes precisely what it tries to explain. As observers of the universe, we rarely question the very act of observing, accepting the materialist view as absolute truth, without realizing that every theory about reality already presupposes a consciousness that formulates it. When a neuroscientist claims that consciousness is generated by the brain, who or what is making this claim? The very consciousness that it's trying to explain. It's as if a character in a novel tried to explain the existence of the author who created it using only the elements available within the narrative. The absurdity of this situation remains invisible to many researchers, blinded by the dazzling brilliance of the materialist paradigm. The empirical evidence supposedly supporting the materialist view brain injuries, altering states of consciousness, drugs modifying perceptions, correlations between neural activity and subjective experiences, is interpreted through a lens that already presupposes materialism as truth. It's a perfect vicious circle. The materialist interpretation of the data reinforces the materialism that guided the interpretation. What we witness in modern science is a fundamental inversion. Consciousness, the primordial condition for any experience, has been relegated to the position of a secondary effect of matter. It's like claiming that light is produced by shadow, or that space is created by the objects that occupy it. This causal inversion represents the deepest conceptual mistake of modern science. You might be wondering, if consciousness is not produced by the brain, then what would its true nature be? Humanity's ancient contemplative traditions, from Indian Advaita Vedanta to aspects of Western Neoplatonic philosophy, offer a radically different answer. Consciousness is not something you possess, but what you fundamentally are. It's not a phenomenon that arises in the world, but the primordial field in which every phenomenon appears. The brain, in this alternative perspective, would not be the producer of consciousness, but an instrument of localization and limitation, a receiver that filters and modulates the universal field of consciousness, allowing for an individualized experience. Just as a prism doesn't create light, but refracts it into different colors, the brain doesn't generate consciousness, but expresses it in particular forms of experience. This paradox invites us to an exploration that transcends the conventional limits of science, leading us to recognize the invisible field that sustains all human experience. The question is not merely academic, but existential. Will we continue accepting a view of reality that transforms our most intimate essence into a biochemical accident? Or will we have the courage to question the fundamental premises that have shaped our understanding of the world? The answer to this question cannot be found through the conceptual mind, as the question itself is formulated within the labyrinth we're trying to escape. A radical shift of attention is needed, not to find new answers, but to recognize the invisible presuppositions that structure our questions. In this video, we will carefully dismantle the materialist assumptions that dominate contemporary scientific thought and explore an alternative view in which consciousness is recognized as the fundamental reality, not as an object of knowledge, but as the knower itself, eternally beyond the categories of subject and object that the conceptual mind tries to impose on reality. The intellectual history of the modern West reveals a narrative that few dare to question: the gradual and relentless rise of scientific materialism. This worldview, which decrees that only matter fundamentally exists and that consciousness is merely a byproduct of brain operations, did not win its dominant position through irrefutable evidence, but through a process of ideological colonization that systematically silenced alternative perspectives. What is rarely admitted in academic circles is that this materialism, trumpeted as the culmination of rational thought, rests on an act of faith as profound as any religious dogma. The belief that unconscious particles, following blind physical laws, could spontaneously generate subjective experience represents a logical leap of metaphysical proportions that has never been, and perhaps never can be, empirically demonstrated. You've been conditioned to believe that matter is primordial, and your consciousness is merely a cerebral epiphenomenon. This materialist narrative is repeated as an unquestionable mantra in universities, scientific journals, and science communication programs. However, examine carefully. It's more of a metaphysical position than a necessary scientific conclusion. Scientific materialism, dressed in the white coat of objectivity, claims a neutrality that, under rigorous examination, reveals itself sown by unverifiable assumptions, a blind faith in matter as ultimate reality. Paradoxically, this position requires a belief as unshakable as that present in the sacred texts that materialism frequently ridicules. The materialist view, by sustaining matter as the only reliable altar, ignores a fundamental question. All material apprehension first passes through the subjective filter of consciousness. Thomas Nagel, contemporary philosopher, identified this problem when he stated, "The inability to consider consciousness as a fundamental aspect of reality is, I believe, the main problem of contemporary science." This epistemological failure is not accidental, but structural, the inevitable result of a methodology that, by definition, excludes subjectivity from its investigation. While Western materialism built its conceptual temples, millennial philosophical traditions like Advaita Vedanta were already presenting a radically different perspective. These non-dualist traditions propose that consciousness, Brahman, constitutes the primordial foundation of reality, while the material world would represent Maya, not an illusion in the sense of non-existence, but a transient overlay that conceals the true nature of reality. The philosopher Gaudapada, one of the first systematic exponents of Advaita Vedanta, declared in the 8th century, There is no dissolution, no creation, no one in bondage, no one seeking liberation, no one liberated. This is the supreme truth. This statement is not a mere rhetorical exercise, but the direct expression of a non-dual understanding of reality that challenges the fragmentation implicit in the materialist view. In the West, thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer, Henri Bergson, and more recently, Bernardo Kastrup, developed philosophical approaches that recognize the primacy of consciousness. Schopenhauer, deeply influenced by the Upanishads, stated that the world is my representation, recognizing that the experience of the world is inseparable from the consciousness that perceives it. Bergson challenged scientific reductionism with his notion of durée, the qualitative experience of time that transcends mechanical quantification. Kastrup, in turn, has defended analytical idealism, proposing that matter is a manifestation of consciousness, not the other way around. The quantum revolution in physics should have demolished the foundations of classical materialism, revealing a universe where observation affects the observed, and the very notion of an independent objective reality becomes problematic. As physicist Max Planck observed, consciousness is fundamental. I regard matter as derived from consciousness. However, this revolutionary insight was conveniently domesticated by the Copenhagen interpretation, which preserved materialism at the price of a conceptual schizophrenia, a quantum world for the microcosm and a Newtonian world for our everyday experience. Erwin Schrödinger, a pioneer of quantum mechanics, even declared, "Consciousness is never experienced in the plural, only in the singular. Consciousness is not only singular, plurality is only apparent. In truth, there is only one mind." This monistic perspective, which recognizes the fundamental unity of consciousness, resonates deeply with the non-dualistic traditions that have always maintained this view. The materialist inversion is not just a philosophical error, but an existential trap. By relegating consciousness to the position of a brain byproduct, materialism alienates us from our most intimate nature, transforming us into biological machines without intrinsic purpose, navigating an indifferent universe. This reductive view has profound consequences, from the ecological crisis to the spiritual void that characterizes much of contemporary society. The question remains, what would be more fundamental, the unconscious matter that supposedly generates consciousness, or consciousness as the primordial field where all experience, including the perception of matter, happens? As we advance in this exploration, consider this possibility. What if scientific materialism, far from being the apex of rational thought, represents the most fundamental conceptual mistake of modernity? Modern science committed its most devastating error by trying to capture what cannot be captured. Dissecting the brain in search of consciousness, neuroscientists resemble children who take apart a radio to find the announcer's voice. This fundamental mistake persists because it ignores an inescapable truth. Consciousness is not an object in the world, but the very condition for any world to appear. The core of this reflection is the primacy of consciousness as the unquestionable foundation of all experience. Unlike any object or phenomenon, consciousness cannot be studied as something external to us. It is the very condition for any investigation to happen. How could the eye see itself? How could consciousness observe itself from outside when it is itself the medium through which all observation becomes possible? When you try to objectify consciousness, you commit a fundamental category error. Consciousness is not something you have, but what you are. It's not a phenomenon among others, but the non-phenomenal space where all phenomena appear. It's not an object of knowledge, but the knower itself, eternally ungraspable by the conceptual instruments that arise within it. This irreducible nature of consciousness can be illustrated through powerful metaphors. Imagine trying to capture the ocean with a net. The net is already wet from the very ocean it intends to contain. Similarly, when science tries to objectify consciousness, it uses instruments that are already immersed in what they intend to measure. A microscope, no matter how powerful, never transcends the filter of the consciousness using it. Philosopher Alan Watts expressed this impossibility by stating, "Trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth." This seemingly simple observation reveals the self-referential nature of any attempt to objectify consciousness. The measuring instrument cannot measure itself, or consider the mirror metaphor. When we look in a mirror, we see our reflected image, but never the act of seeing itself. Consciousness is like the space in which images appear, not an image among others. It precedes thought and matter, becoming the invisible foundation upon which all theories are built. This constitutive invisibility of consciousness explains why it continually escapes scientific attempts at objectification. As Indian philosopher Nisargadatta Maharaj stated, "You can know the known, but you cannot know the knower." This statement is not a linguistic paradox, but the direct expression of the non-dual nature of reality. Music offers another clarifying analogy. Just as music doesn't reside in the piano keys, but flows in the acoustic space, consciousness is not contained in the brain, but is the field where the brain experience happens. The brain would be like an instrument that modulates and expresses consciousness, not its generative source. When the instrument is damaged, the expression of the music is affected, but this doesn't mean that the music is produced by the instrument. This conceptual inversion, recognizing consciousness as primordial and the material world as its manifestation, is not merely a philosophical exercise, but a radical reorientation of our understanding of reality. As physicist Amit Goswami observed, consciousness, not matter, is the basis of all existence. Ancient contemplative traditions have always known this truth. When sage Ramana Maharshi was questioned about the nature of the universe, he responded with a devastating counter-question: "For whom does the universe exist?" This counter-question exposes the hidden assumption in every inquiry about reality, the prior presence of a questioning consciousness. Modern neurosciences, despite their impressive technological apparatus, confront the same impasse. The more they advance in understanding the neural correlates of consciousness, the more evident it becomes that correlation does not imply causation. As neuroscientist Francisco Varela noted, consciousness is not something the brain does, it's something the brain participates in. These metaphors help us understand why consciousness cannot be reduced to a cerebral artifact. It is simultaneously the stage and audience of all experience, prior to the formation of thoughts and theories. As philosopher David Chalmers stated when formulating the hard problem of consciousness, why is the performance of specific physical biological functions accompanied by conscious experience in the first place? The answer that emerges from this investigation is radical. The question already contains a category error by assuming that physical processes could, in principle, generate consciousness. It would be like asking, what color is the song of birds? A confusion between ontologically distinct domains. By recognizing the primacy of consciousness, we don't replace one dogma with another, but awaken to the true nature of our experience. Consciousness is not something to be explained by materialist or spiritualist theories. It is the very field where all theories emerge and disappear. This understanding transcends the conflict between science and spirituality, revealing that both are complementary expressions of the same field of consciousness, exploring different aspects of reality with different conceptual instruments. When you recognize consciousness as your irreducible foundation, the question is no longer, how does the brain produce consciousness? But, how does consciousness manifest through brain structures? Western science built a conceptual empire upon a fundamental illusion, the separation between observer and observed. This dichotomy, so deeply rooted in our thinking that we rarely question it, reveals itself as a fabrication of the conceptual mind when subjected to rigorous analysis. The inseparable nature of subject and object constitutes one of the most intriguing aspects of this investigation. As Indian philosopher Ramana Maharshi observed, the separation between observer and observed is an illusion perpetuated by conceptual thought. In reality, both are manifestations of the same field of consciousness. The metaphor of the chalkboard squeak and the silence before music perfectly illustrates this relationship. The instrument may fail, but the listener consciousness remains intact. When you observe an object, be it a tree, an emotion, or a thought, who is the observer? The natural impulse is to answer, me, of course. But who is this me that observes? If you try to capture it, you discover that it continually escapes. Like a shadow that recedes when we try to reach it, the observer can never be transformed into an object of observation without ceasing to be the observer. This elusiveness is not accidental, but reveals the non-dual nature of reality. This perspective offers a new understanding of phenomena such as dementia or brain collapse. Instead of understanding them as proof that consciousness is produced by the brain, we can compare them to ink erasing a drawing without compromising the space in which the drawing existed. The breakdown of brain function affects only the instrument, not the musician, the consciousness that neither begins nor ends with neuronal activity. Neuroscientist Wilder Penfield, after decades of electrically stimulating the brains of conscious patients, concluded, "The mind seems to act independently of the brain in decision-making situations." This observation, coming from one of the pioneers of modern neurosurgery, directly challenges the materialist dogma that the mind is merely a product of brain activity. Consider the cases documented by neurosurgeon Eben Alexander, who experienced profound conscious experiences during a period when his neocortex was completely inactive due to severe bacterial meningitis. Or the consistent reports of near-death experiences, where clinically dead patients report verifiable veridical perceptions that occurred when their brain was demonstrably non-functional. These phenomena, far from being anomalies to be discarded, point to a relationship between brain and consciousness fundamentally different from that proposed by materialism. Philosopher David Chalmers called this challenge the hard problem of consciousness. How can physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience? Decades of neuroscience research have resulted in increasingly detailed maps of correlations between brain states and conscious experiences, but have not explained how matter could generate consciousness. As neuroscientist Christoph Koch observed, correlation does not imply causation. The fact that mental states correspond to brain states does not prove that the brain produces the mind. When you watch a television program, destroying the device certainly interrupts your ability to see the program, but this doesn't mean the device was generating the content. Similarly, brain damage may alter the expression of consciousness without proving that the brain is its original source. The illusion of certainty and the questioner's cycle represent another crucial aspect. If we examine the foundations of scientific thought, we find a self-referential loop. Every assertion requires verification, but who verifies the verifier? Confidence in the scientific method points to the instrument, but ignores the hand that wields it. As philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein pointed out, the ladder must be thrown away after one has climbed up on it. At some point, every system of thought reaches its limit. The Buddha illustrated this issue by refusing to answer metaphysical questions, comparing them to a poisoned arrow. Removing the poison is more urgent than discovering who shot the arrow. Similarly, questioning who authorizes the system is not an intellectual act, but a silent movement that dismantles habitual thought structures. This analysis reveals why scientific materialism, despite its conceptual sophistication, remains fundamentally unable to explain consciousness. It seeks in the object what constitutes the subject itself. As philosopher Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj stated, the mind creates the abyss and the bridge. The abyss is the illusory separation between consciousness and matter. The bridge is the non-dual understanding that recognizes their fundamental unity. Quantum physicist Wolfgang Pauli recognized this limitation when he stated, "It is more important that a proposition be interesting than that it be true." This observation, far from being an abandonment of truth, is a recognition of the inherent limits to any conceptual system. The ultimate truth is not a proposition to be verified, but the living consciousness within which all propositions appear. When you understand that the questioner and the questioned are manifestations of the same field of consciousness, the self-referential nature of all inquiry about consciousness becomes evident. How could the ocean contain itself in one of its waves? How could infinite consciousness be contained in one of its finite movements? This understanding does not deny the value of scientific investigation, but situates it in its appropriate context, as an expression of consciousness exploring its own manifestations, not as the final arbiter of reality. The conceptual revolution we propose, recognizing the primacy of consciousness over matter, is not merely a philosophical curiosity confined to academic circles. This paradigmatic inversion has profound and transformative implications for every aspect of our existence, from our understanding of death to our relationship with suffering and the meaning of life. What's at stake is not just an alternative theory, but a complete reimagining of human reality. At the philosophical level, this perspective definitively dissolves the Cartesian dichotomy between mind and matter that has torn Western thought apart for centuries. In its place emerges a monistic view in which consciousness is recognized as the single, irreducible foundation of reality. As contemporary philosopher Bernardo Kastrup proposes, we can understand the universe as an immense ocean of consciousness, of which individual minds would be like whirlpools, temporary structures within the same fundamental field. This metaphor of the ocean and its waves perfectly captures the relationship between universal consciousness and its individual manifestations. Just as a wave is not separate from the ocean, but a localized expression of its nature, you are not an isolated entity, but a particular expression of the universal field of consciousness. The apparent separation between different minds is as illusory as the apparent separation between different waves in the same ocean. Intellectual and scientific elites fiercely resist this understanding because it threatens the foundations of their epistemic power. Materialism is not just a scientific theory, but a mechanism of social control that keeps humanity disconnected from its true nature, alienated and therefore manipulable. When you believe you are just a brain producing an illusion of consciousness, you become vulnerable to all kinds of manipulation, from consumerism to ideological fanaticism. In everyday life, understanding the primacy of consciousness radically transforms our relationship with fundamental existential questions. Death, for example, ceases to be the absolute end that materialism proclaims. If consciousness is primordial and not contained in the brain, its essence is not limited to temporary physical existence. As psychiatrist and consciousness researcher Stanislav Grof suggested, this perspective deeply resonates with reports of transcendental experiences, non-ordinary states of consciousness, and near-death phenomena, which frequently include the sensation of transcending the limits of ego and physical body. The thousands of consistent reports of near-death experiences documented by researchers such as Raymond Moody, Pim van Lommel, and Sam Parnia suggest that consciousness can persist even when all brain activity ceases, an observation that is incomprehensible within the materialist paradigm, but perfectly coherent with the view of consciousness as the foundation of reality. This view also offers a valuable counterpoint to the dominant materialist reductionism in our culture. Neuroscientist Francisco Varela, co-founder of Inactive Cognitive Sciences, proposed that consciousness is not something that occurs inside the brain, but emerges from the dynamic interaction between organism and environment. His perspective, inspired by both biology and Buddhism, suggests that conscious experience is fundamentally relational, not reducible to isolated neuronal processes. You might be wondering, if consciousness is fundamental, why do our experiences seem so dependent on the brain? The answer is that the brain does not generate consciousness, but filters and modulates it, just as a prism does not create light, but refracts its different frequencies. When the brain is altered by drugs, injuries, or meditative states, the filter is modified, resulting in different expressions of the same fundamental consciousness. Controversies in this field are intense and deliberately exacerbated by defenders of the materialist status quo. Critics argue that attributing primacy to consciousness would be a return to philosophical idealism, a position that would have been overcome by scientific advancement. They argue that explanations based on physical processes are more parsimonious and empirically verifiable. However, as philosopher Thomas Nagel pointed out, explanatory parsimony is no guarantee of truth. A simple but incomplete explanation may be less valuable than a more complex but comprehensive one. The parsimony argument proves especially fragile when confronted with the hard problem of consciousness. No materialist theory, no matter how elaborate, has managed to explain how unconscious physical processes could generate subjective experience. The view of consciousness as fundamental eliminates this problem at the root. We don't need to explain how matter generates consciousness, because matter itself is a manifestation of consciousness. The journey we've taken reveals a truth as simple as it is revolutionary. Consciousness is not a phenomenon among others, but the primordial stage where all phenomena manifest. This understanding dissolves the fundamental paradox that has tormented philosophers and scientists for centuries. How could something know itself? The answer emerges with crystal clarity. The knower can never be known as an object, for it is the very condition of possibility for all knowledge. You have been systematically deceived by a system of thought that transformed the secondary into primary and the essential into derivative. At the end of this journey of questioning, we are invited to recognize that consciousness is not an object, structure, or phenomenon among others, but the condition of possibility for all experience. It is not born, nor does it die. It doesn't remember or forget. It is the permanent stage where thoughts, sensations, and memories dance ephemerally. This understanding transcends the dichotomy between mysticism and materialism, recognizing consciousness as that which makes both science and spirituality possible. The analogy of the shadow projected on the mirror, which refracts instead of reflecting, highlights the impossibility of the mind seeing itself without resorting to a point of support beyond itself. Imagine a mirror that not only reflects, but refracts what presents itself before it, distorting the projected image. This is precisely the situation of the conceptual mind trying to understand consciousness. It inevitably distorts what it tries to capture, creating an image that no longer corresponds to the original reality. This immaculate essence, often called pure being in contemplative traditions, is not something to be achieved, but the invisible foundation that remains when all searching ceases. As Zen master Dogen declared, "Abandon body-mind and cast yourself into the house of the Buddha." This abandonment is not a denial of bodily existence, but a transcendence of exclusive identification with the body-mind, recognizing its nature as a manifestation of universal consciousness. The mystics, yogis, and contemplators of all authentic spiritual traditions were not seeking altered states or exotic experiences. They were awakening to this fundamental truth about the nature of consciousness. What we interpret as religious or philosophical diversity is, in its deepest essence, different languages pointing to the same non-dual reality, what Sufis call the secret of secrets, and Vedantists the supreme knowledge. Our investigator, abandoning the search for definitive answers within the limits of the conceptual mind, discovers that the question itself contains the answer, not as an intellectual formulation, but as the silent presence that precedes and sustains all interrogation. As physicist and philosopher Arthur Eddington suggested, the solution to the problem of experience is in the experience of the problem. This understanding is not an intellectual achievement, but an existential awakening, a direct recognition of the nature of consciousness that transcends all theories and concepts. It's not about believing in something new, but giving up the beliefs that obscure what has always been present. As Zen Master Bankei stated, to abide in the unborn is the supreme liberation. The implications of this understanding are dizzying. If consciousness is fundamental, then you are not an isolated entity navigating a strange universe, but an individualized expression of the universal field of consciousness, as intimately connected with everything that exists as a wave is connected with the ocean. The separation we experience is real only at the level of form, not essence. What questions would you stop asking if you understood that the questioner is the answer itself? What belief structures, materialist or spiritualist, would you abandon upon recognizing consciousness as their shared foundation? Perhaps true awakening is not in finding definitive answers, but in inhabiting the open space that exists before any question. Philosopher Wei Wu Wei expressed this truth with devastating precision. Why can't you free yourself? Because you are you. Eliminate the you, and you will be free. This you is not your conscious essence, but the identification with a limited character, separated from the totality of existence. Materialist science, by declaring that you are just a temporary arrangement of atoms producing an illusion of consciousness, has stolen your metaphysical dignity and cosmic belonging. By recognizing the primacy of consciousness, you reclaim your true nature as an expression of the fundamental mystery that sustains all existence. All change begins with understanding your role as co-creator, and the only way to connect with this divine intelligence is through meditation. We've developed a set of audio tools to help you access this higher state of consciousness. To learn more and get immediate access, click the link on the screen or in the comments. If this video resonated with you, write in the comments. It made sense to me.